He said it quietly, almost tenderly, as if cruelty wrapped in calm would hurt less. "I'll send you to that nursing home one way or another, and gladly." For a moment, even the ticking clock seemed to stop. I stood there, the weight of his words pressing against my chest until I could barely breathe. The son I had carried, fed, and prayed for now spoke to me like a stranger who wanted a problem removed. He stood near the window, light hitting the side of his face, and for the first time in my life I noticed there was nothing of mine left in his expression, no trace of kindness, no echo of the boy who used to chase butterflies in the yard. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I simply watched him, my silence louder than anything I could have said. I could almost hear my heart asking, "Is this really the child I raised?" My hands shook, not from fear, but from the force it took to stay still. Because I knew that if I spoke, I might explode, and I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me shatter. He talked about responsibility, about how I was getting difficult, how his wife was losing patience, how this arrangement wasn't sustainable. Every word landed like a slow-burning insult delivered with professional calm. To him, I wasn't his mother anymore. I was an inconvenience, an overdue bill, a heavy suitcase he wanted someone else to carry. He spoke of me as if I were already gone, as if love could expire quietly in the corner of a living room. When he finished, he looked at me, waiting for tears, for begging, for surrender. But I simply nodded and said nothing, because while he thought he was ending something, he was, without knowing it, beginning something far bigger, my awakening. Inside me, a storm stirred, years of sacrifice replaying in sharp detail. The nights I worked late to pay his school fees. The mornings I skipped breakfast so he could eat enough. The days I walked home in the rain so he'd have money for the bus. I had built a life around him, and now he wanted to dismantle it brick by brick. But what he didn't understand was that the same hands that raised him could also rebuild a future without him. He leaned against the wall and said, "I'll handle the paperwork this week. It'll be easier for everyone." Easier for everyone. He said it like sending me away was an act of mercy. I almost laughed. Not out loud, but deep inside, a bitter sound rose that tasted like survival. When he left the room, I stood frozen for a long time. The coffee on the table had gone cold, untouched. The sunlight had shifted to the other side of the house, leaving me in a quiet shadow. And yet, that shadow didn't feel lonely, it felt powerful. Because in that stillness, I made a decision. I walked to the kitchen, turned on the kettle, and watched the steam rise. My reflection in the window looked older, yes, but there was something new in it, a faint, fierce light. He thought age made me powerless. He thought dependence meant defeat. He had no idea that mothers have their own kind of strength, the kind that hides beneath calm breaths and gentle voices, waiting for the day it's needed. That night, when I lay in bed, I didn't replay his words. I replayed my silence. Because my silence wasn't weakness, it was preparation. I realized that if anyone would decide where I lived, it wouldn't be him. It would be me. And though I didn't know how or when, I promised myself one thing. He would never see me beg for mercy again. The next morning, I heard him on the phone talking about the facility, his voice steady, businesslike. "Yes, there's an opening. We'll move her in 2 days, he said. 2 days. That's how long it takes, apparently, to erase a lifetime of motherhood. I poured myself another cup of coffee and smiled, not a happy smile, but a knowing one. Because while he thought he was making arrangements for my end, I was quietly preparing for my beginning. He believed he was in control, that I'd fade quietly into whatever future he chose for me. But belief is fragile. And that day, while he stood tall in his illusion, I stood silently in my truth. He had no idea that the woman sitting across from him wasn't broken. She was rebuilding. Because sometimes, the calmest faces hide the loudest storms. And sometimes, a mother's silence isn't surrender, it's the sound of revenge learning how to breathe. That night I couldn't sleep. The house creaked softly, like it remembered what it once was, a home, not a battlefield. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the quiet heavier than any noise could be. His words kept circling back, one way or another, and gladly. Gladly. The way he'd said it burned more than the threat itself. My mind slipped backward, far away from this cold silence, into years that smelled of bread and soap and laughter. I remembered the first time I saw this house. It was nothing but a cracked foundation and a promise. Robert and I stood there, our shoes sinking into wet dirt, holding blueprints we couldn't afford. We built it anyway, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, prayer by prayer. When Marcus was born, we brought him home wrapped in a yellow blanket. He fit into one hand, and for a moment, I thought the world had folded itself around us in protection. Back then, the sound of his laugh filled every corner. He used to run barefoot through the kitchen while I cooked, leaving little muddy footprints I never wanted to clean. Robert would lift him high, and Marcus would stretch his arms out like wings, shouting, "I'm flying, Daddy!" We didn't have much, but we had warmth, and for a long time, that was enough. Then life happened the way it always does, slowly at first, then all at once. Robert's heart gave out one winter morning, and the world froze with him. I remember Marcus standing by the window, silent, 14 years old and already taller than me. I tried to hold him, but he pulled away. From that day forward, he looked at me differently, not as his mother, but as the person who'd failed to keep his father alive. I told myself it was grief. That boys are cruel when they don't know how to cry. I let him slam doors, speak sharply, disappear for nights without explanation. I covered for him at school, worked extra shifts so he could go to college, even when my hands were too swollen to hold a pen. Because that's what mothers do. We protect, we excuse, we give, and when we have nothing left to give, we dig deeper. Years blurred into each other. Birthdays, graduations, first suits, first jobs. He moved to the city, sent brief calls, shorter messages. Busy, Mom. Can't visit this weekend. We'll call later. Later never came. But I still set his favorite plate at the table every Sunday, as if faith could turn emptiness into presence. When he finally returned, older, confident, wrapped in the smell of expensive cologne, I thought maybe the distance had softened him. But it hadn't. He walked through the house like an inspector, not a son. His eyes wandered across the walls, not with nostalgia, but with calculation. "You should think about selling this place," he said casually. "It's too much for you to manage." He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at the floor, at the windows, at the potential profit in every corner. I laughed lightly to hide the sting. "This house has survived more than we have, Marcus." He didn't laugh back. After that, it began. The subtle pushing, the guilt-wrapped suggestions, the phone calls that felt like interrogations. "Mom, it's for your own good." "Mom, you can't live alone forever." "Mom, I found a great buyer." Every time I hung up, something inside me cracked a little more. The boy I had once protected now wanted to protect his inheritance from me. I tried to remember when love turned into transaction. Was it the day I stopped being needed? The day he realized I had nothing left to offer but my presence? It's strange how quickly children forget the hands that carried them. But mothers never forget. We carry the sound of their first cry like a permanent echo inside our chests. That echo kept me awake now. I turned on the bedside lamp and looked around the room. The framed pictures, the worn-out curtains, the little marks on the wall from when Marcus measured his height each birthday. Every inch of this house was a record of my devotion. And he wanted to erase it, to hand it over to strangers, to pretend none of it had ever belonged to me. I walked to the dresser, opened the top drawer, and touched the edge of a wooden box, the one I'd kept hidden for years. Inside were small proofs of my life, the deed to the house, Robert's old watch, a few $100s I'd saved quietly. I hadn't opened it in a long time. Tonight, it felt like the only thing still mine. I ran my fingers over the papers, the ink faded but still alive, like me. As the night deepened, I realized something with quiet certainty. Love given endlessly without respect eventually turns into self-erasure. And I was done disappearing. Marcus thought I was too old to start over, too tired to fight. He thought wrong. I had carried him once. I could carry myself now. I closed the box gently and whispered into the dark, "You may have forgotten where you came from, but I haven't forgotten who I am." The air didn't answer, but the silence felt different. Not empty this time, but waiting. Because when a mother remembers her worth, the whole world shifts a little. The next morning, I moved through the house like a ghost pretending to live. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, touching the walls that once held laughter, now painted in quiet betrayal. I made breakfast out of habit, eggs, toast, coffee, but everything tasted like ashes. When Marcus came downstairs, his tone was brisk, professional, almost proud of the decision he'd made. "I talked to the facility," he said, buttering his toast without looking at me. "They have an opening. It's comfortable. You'll have company. You'll be safe there." Safe. The word rolled off his tongue like an insult. I wanted to tell him that I had been safe long before he was even born, that I had survived more storms than he could ever imagine. But I didn't say a word. I just nodded and took another sip of coffee, letting the silence weigh heavier than any argument could. Because now, silence was my weapon. He mistook it for surrender. He thought my quietness meant I had accepted defeat. He didn't know that inside me, something was shifting, a slow, powerful awakening. For years, I had built my life around being his mother, forgetting that before him, I had been a woman. A fighter. A dreamer. A survivor. Now that version of me was stirring again, stretching her limbs after a long sleep. When he left for work, the house exhaled. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock. It felt like the whole place was holding its breath with me. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom and opened the closet, reaching for that small wooden box, the one I had touched the night before. Inside were pieces of my life he had forgotten existed, the property deed with my name still shining in black ink, Robert's old wedding ring, a few savings, and a faded photograph of me at 23, smiling, fierce, unafraid. I stared at that young woman for a long time. She looked like someone I once knew, someone I could still become again. I sat down on the bed and opened a blank notebook. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up a pen. I began to write. Not a letter, not a goodbye, but a list. A plan. Because if Marcus thought he could control the rest of my life, he was about to learn that I had my own plans. I listed everything I still owned, every document, every detail he didn't know about. Then I wrote 2 words beneath it. Take back. That simple phrase felt like oxygen in my lungs. I had spent years giving, time, energy, love, without keeping anything for myself. But today the giving ended. Today I would start reclaiming. I began small. I cleaned the house slowly, touching every object that held a story. I opened drawers, looked through cabinets, organizing not out of habit but strategy. I was taking inventory of my life, what was truly mine, and what I was ready to leave behind. Each step made me feel lighter, stronger. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was awake. That afternoon, I stepped outside into the garden. The wind carried the scent of the roses I'd planted decades ago. Their petals were fading, yet they still stood proud, alive. I ran my hand over one of the stems, feeling the thorns prick gently at my fingertips. It was a reminder, beauty and pain always grew together. I smiled faintly. We're still here, I whispered. For the first time in months, I felt peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on others, but the kind that grows quietly inside you when you finally stop waiting for someone to save you. I realized I didn't need permission to take control of my life. I just needed courage, and courage I had plenty of. That evening, when Marcus returned, he noticed the subtle change in me. I saw it in his eyes. He looked confused, maybe even nervous. My posture was straighter. My voice calm but certain. When he mentioned the facility again, I simply said, "We'll see." Nothing more. It was only 2 words, but they landed like a stone in water, rippling through him. He frowned. "We'll see? What's that supposed to mean?" I smiled faintly. "It means I'll think about it." He didn't know that I had already decided. He didn't know that the woman standing in front of him was not the same mother he had dismissed the day before. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't beg the heavens for answers. I sat by the window, notebook in my lap, looking out at the streetlights. My mind was clear, my heart steady. I knew exactly what I was going to do. He thought he was taking control of my life, but he was only pushing me closer to freedom. And one day soon, when he tried to look for me, all he'd find would be the echo of his own mistake. And a mother who had finally remembered who she was. From that night on, my silence had purpose. Each word I didn't say was a step forward, each quiet moment a part of something larger. Marcus believed the calm meant resignation, but calm is deceptive. Calm is where storms learn patience. Days passed, and I played my role perfectly. I still cooked, still smiled faintly, still asked about his work as though everything was normal. But inside, my mind was a map. I memorized his schedule, his meetings, the hours when he wouldn't be home. I needed space and time, not to escape just yet, but to prepare. The first step was to gather proof of my independence. I took out the deed to the house, the one with my name alone printed on the front page. I slipped it into a plain envelope and tucked it beneath my coat. Then, one afternoon, when Marcus left for a business lunch, I walked to town. My legs trembled at first. It had been a long time since I'd gone out alone. But with every step, the weight lifted. The air felt sharper, cleaner, like freedom waiting patiently. At the small grocery corner near the market, I ran into Serena Hayes, my neighbor from down the street. She was carrying a basket of apples, her apron dusted with flour. "Thelma, you look pale," she said, her eyes kind. "Is everything all right?" And for the first time in months, I didn't lie. "No," I said softly. "But I'm working on it." She didn't pry. Instead, she guided me into her kitchen, the smell of warm bread wrapping around us like comfort. We sat by the window, and I told her everything, every insult disguised as concern, every plan my son had made to take my life apart piece by piece. Serena didn't gasp. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, her eyes steady on mine. When I finished, she reached across the table and said, "You don't have to do this alone. Tell me what you need." Her words cracked something inside me, not pain, but relief. After years of being unseen, I was finally visible again. "I need to leave," I whispered. "But I need to do it quietly." Serena nodded. "Then we'll do it quietly." That afternoon, we made a plan. Not a grand, reckless escape, but something slow, careful, deliberate, like baking bread from scratch. Serena knew someone who managed small rentals 2 towns away, near Asheville, North Carolina. "It's quiet there," she said. "Nobody asks questions." I nodded. It sounded perfect. The second step was money. I couldn't leave empty-handed. That night, after Marcus went to bed, I opened the drawer where I'd kept my jewelry and heirlooms, things long forgotten, covered in dust but not in value. A gold chain my mother once wore. A silver bracelet Robert had given me on our first anniversary. I packed them into a small pouch. The next morning, under the pretense of visiting the pharmacy, I sold them quietly to a jeweler I trusted. He didn't ask why. He just counted the bills and said, "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Price." With that money, I opened a small new account under my maiden name. No one knew about it, not Marcus, not even the bank clerk who glanced at me with mild curiosity as I signed the forms. I walked out with the receipt folded tightly in my hand, the paper trembling with promise. Every evening, while Marcus spoke on the phone with his lawyer or scrolled through property listings, I would sit quietly in the living room pretending to read. But in reality, I was watching him, not with fear anymore, but with clarity. I could see the small things now, how he avoided looking at me directly, how guilt flickered and died in his eyes before pride took its place. He was convincing himself that this was the right thing to do. People always justify cruelty by calling it care. Serena started visiting more often. Sometimes she brought bread, other times, just her presence. We spoke in coded phrases, always careful. "How's the garden?" she'd ask. "It's growing," I'd answer, both of us knowing what it meant. The day of my departure drew closer, and I began to pack small things, documents, photos, a few clothes, hidden in plain sight. Then one evening, I overheard Marcus on the phone again. His voice was low but firm. "Yes, she's quiet now. It'll be easier to handle everything once she's out. I'll sign next week." That was it, the final confirmation I needed. I went to my room, closed the door softly, and stood by the mirror. My reflection didn't look old anymore. It looked determined. "You think you're winning, Marcus," I murmured, "but you're about to lose the one thing you never valued enough, me." That night, I wrote a short note and placed it inside my wooden box beside the deed. Freedom doesn't ask permission. It just waits for courage. The next sunrise, I looked out at the horizon, the world painted gold and calm. Everything was still. Everything was ready. Because the plan was no longer an idea, it was in motion. The morning of my escape began like any other, ordinary on the surface, but electric underneath. The air felt heavy, as if the house itself knew what was about to happen. Marcus had left early for his meeting with the attorney. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, and when the door shut behind him, the silence that followed was no longer my enemy. It was my signal. I moved through the rooms carefully, not like someone sneaking away, but like someone reclaiming what was already hers. Every step I took whispered years of unspoken strength. I poured myself one last cup of coffee in the kitchen I had built with my own hands. The cup trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the finality of it all. I looked around. The framed photos, the clock that had marked decades of life, the curtains Robert and I had chosen together. Everything looked the same, yet I was no longer part of it. I set the cup down and took out the letter I'd written the night before. I had read it a dozen times, each word sharper than the last. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even a goodbye. It was a declaration. "Marcus, you believed my silence was weakness. You believed you could own what I built. But this house, this life, and this strength belong to me. I will not live where love feels like debt. I will not stay where respect has died. You will wake up one day and realize that what you called a burden was your blessing. You have taken everything from me except my will, and that is the one thing you can never touch. A mother's love is not eternal. It's a choice. And I am choosing myself. Thelma." I folded the letter neatly and placed it under the crystal vase in the dining room, the one he hated but I always loved. It wasn't meant to hurt him. It was meant to remind him that not every mother stays waiting for redemption. Some mothers simply walk away. When the clock struck 10, I opened my bedroom closet and pulled out my single suitcase. Inside were the essentials, my documents, my hidden savings, a few clothes, and the photograph of Robert smiling at the beach. I zipped it shut slowly, the sound slicing through the silence like a clean cut between my old life and my new one. Outside, Serena's car waited at the corner, engine humming softly. She gave me a nod when she saw me through the window. I hesitated for one heartbeat, then another. But hesitation is just fear dressed in memory, and I was done being afraid. I took one last look at the house, not as a prisoner, but as a creator saying farewell to her own masterpiece. I touched the doorway gently, the way you touch someone you've forgiven. Then I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, not quietly, but firmly. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I walked toward Serena. The suitcase felt lighter than I expected. Maybe because I wasn't carrying guilt anymore. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice calm, warm, familiar. "I've been ready for years," I said. We drove away without music. The streets blurred past, but I didn't look back. Not once. The house shrank in the rearview mirror until it was just another in the landscape of my past. The sun broke through the clouds as we crossed the bridge out of town, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I inhaled without pain. Freedom doesn't make a sound. It hums quietly in your bones. I could feel it now, humming through me. I glanced at Serena, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes fixed ahead. "Where will you go first?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "Anywhere that doesn't have ghosts." We both smiled. It wasn't joy exactly, it was relief, that deep, trembling relief of a soul no longer trapped. Behind me, I imagined Marcus coming home, calling my name, finding the letter. I imagined his disbelief turning to anger, then confusion, then silence. Maybe he'd finally understand that I was never the fragile woman he thought I was. I had always been the backbone of that house, and now that backbone had walked away. The road stretched endlessly before us. The world felt vast again, full of possibilities I had long stopped believing in. I didn't know where we were headed, but for the first time in decades, that uncertainty felt like peace. I wasn't running away. I was walking toward myself. And that, I realized, was the most powerful revenge of all. Marcus came home that evening with the casual confidence of a man who believes the world waits for him to arrive. His car door slammed, echoing down the driveway like punctuation on a victory he hadn't earned. He unlocked the front door, already rehearsing in his head how he'd tell me that the facility was ready, how he'd justify it as the best choice for both of us. But the house didn't answer. No smell of coffee. No soft footsteps. No quiet hum of me moving through the kitchen. The silence was so thick it startled him. He called out once, "Mom," half expecting my usual, gentle reply. When nothing came, he frowned and checked his watch, muttering, "She's probably in her room." He walked to the kitchen. The cup on the table was clean, the chair tucked in neatly. Then he saw it, the crystal vase on the dining room table, and beneath it, a folded piece of paper. My letter. His breath caught. For the first time in years, Marcus hesitated. He unfolded it with trembling hands, eyes scanning line by line until the words began to blur. When he reached the end, "A mother's love is not eternal, it's a choice, and I am choosing myself," his jaw tightened. He tore the paper in half, then again, until the floor was littered with fragments of what he had never thought he could lose. But anger couldn't fill the emptiness that rushed in. He moved through the house like a man searching for proof that his control still existed. He opened drawers, checked closets, even the basement. Everything was tidy. Too tidy. The wooden box from my dresser was gone, the photos missing, the documents removed. Every trace of me, erased with the same precision he once used to erase my voice. And in that spotless silence, Marcus felt something unfamiliar. Fear. Not the kind that comes from danger, but the kind that comes from realization. He had spent years treating love like ownership, mistaking obedience for affection, presence for possession. Now, standing in the empty kitchen, he finally understood the difference between having a mother and deserving one. He sat down heavily at the table. His phone buzzed, his wife asking if I'd finally left. He didn't answer. For the first time, he couldn't explain what he was feeling. The anger that had once fueled him now collapsed under its own weight, leaving only regret. He picked up the shards of glass from the shattered vase he'd knocked over in his rage and sliced his finger. A small cut, but deep enough to sting, a reminder that carelessness always draws blood. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps that never came. Every gust of wind through the trees sounded like my voice calling his name. He tried to convince himself I'd return, that I'd forgive him again, that mothers always come back. But deep down, he knew. This time, forgiveness had left the building with its suitcase in hand. Days turned into weeks. The dust began to settle, literally. He stopped opening the curtains. He stopped cooking. He lived on takeout and guilt. One morning, he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Eyes dull, hair unkempt, posture heavy. For all his success, all his property, all his control, he had never looked so poor. He started calling my phone, over and over. Each call went straight to voicemail. "Mom, it's me. Just call me back, okay?" The tone softened with every message, cracking a little more each time. "I just want to talk. Then, please." But the silence on the other end never broke. Eventually, he drove to Serena's house. He knocked on the door, his voice shaking with impatience. No one answered. The curtains were drawn, the driveway empty. He left angry, but the anger dissolved halfway home, replaced by something colder, realization. The world was moving on without him, and he was stuck in the ruins of his own choices. That evening, he sat on the porch, the same spot where I once watched the sunset. The sky turned orange, then violet, then dark. He stared at the horizon as if it could give him answers. But the only thing that came was memory, tiny, piercing memories of childhood, the sound of my laughter, the warmth of my hands fixing his collar, the nights I stayed up until his fever broke. Those moments rose inside him like ghosts, reminding him that love, once neglected, becomes absence. And as the last light faded, Marcus whispered to the empty yard, "I didn't think you'd actually go." His voice cracked, barely audible over the wind. But the wind carried it anyway, scattering it across the garden like a confession too late to matter. That night, for the first time in his adult life, Marcus cried, not out of guilt alone, but out of the hollow ache of understanding. He hadn't lost a house. He hadn't lost control. He had lost the one person who would have forgiven him even when he didn't deserve it. And that was the consequence. Because sometimes, losing everything you took for granted is the only way life teaches you what truly mattered all along. The morning sun slipped through the thin curtains of my new home, warming my face before my eyes even opened. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up to the weight of footsteps, demands, or the sound of someone else deciding what my day should be. There was only stillness, and the gentle hum of life beginning again. Serena was already in the kitchen, her soft humming mixing with the smell of coffee and fresh bread. "Good morning, Thelma," she said, smiling over her shoulder. I smiled back, a small, unguarded smile that felt new, like learning how to breathe again. The house was small, with creaky floors and mismatched furniture, but to me it was a palace. Every corner carried something I hadn't felt in years: safety without control, silence without fear, peace without permission. I walked slowly to the window and looked out at the horizon, a stretch of trees, a dirt road, and a world that no longer frightened me. Each day since I'd left, I'd been relearning ordinary things: how to cook for joy and not duty, how to walk without rushing, how to laugh without apologizing. At first, my hands shook when I poured coffee. My voice trembled when strangers spoke kindly. It's strange how kindness can hurt when you're used to cruelty. It scrapes against all the places you've been numb. But little by little, I began to soften. Sometimes at night, I still dream of Marcus. Not the man he became, but the boy he once was, with scraped knees and chocolate-stained cheeks. In the dream, he's laughing again, and for a fleeting moment, I can forgive the man for forgetting that boy. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's freedom wearing quiet shoes. And I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean returning. It means releasing. One afternoon, Serena and I walked to the nearby market. The people there didn't know my story. To them, I was just another woman buying apples and flour. But to me, it was more. Every interaction was a small act of defiance, proof that I was still alive, still capable, still enough. We stopped by a small stall where an elderly man sold handmade plants. A delicate ivy caught my eye, its leaves strong, reaching. I bought it and told him, "This one's for my new beginning." Back home, I placed the ivy near the window where the light was strongest. It felt symbolic, a living reminder that growth always happens quietly, sometimes in places where you were once broken. Weeks passed. Serena started her embroidery workshop, and I began volunteering at the local community center, teaching young mothers how to sew, how to budget, how to stand firm when the world tries to bend them. I watched them laugh, share, cry, and I realized something powerful. My story wasn't an ending, it was a guide. My pain had turned into purpose. One evening, as the sky painted itself in orange and purple, I sat outside with Serena, 2 cups of tea steaming between us. She looked at me and said softly, "Do you miss him?" I thought for a long time. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not the way I used to. I miss what I hoped he'd be. I miss the dream of being loved back the way I loved." She nodded, understanding without words. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. "But I'm not angry anymore," I continued. "Because if he hadn't pushed me away, I might never have found myself again." And that was the truth. Every cruelty, every insult, every betrayal, they had led me here, to this quiet peace, to this reclaimed life. Sometimes, we have to lose everything we thought defined us to discover who we truly are. That night, I sat by my desk and wrote one last letter, not to Marcus, but to myself. You did it. You walked through the fire and came out whole. You chose yourself without hatred, and that is the bravest choice of all. The world tried to silence you, but you turned your silence into power. Keep going. Keep living. You are free now. I folded the paper and slipped it inside my journal. It wasn't meant to be read, it was meant to be felt. As the crickets sang outside and the moon climbed high, I whispered a final truth to the night. A mother's presence is worth more than any money, but so is her peace. The next morning, the ivy had sprouted a new leaf. I smiled. Life, it seemed, had finally begun again. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments by typing 1 red heart. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you believe every mother deserves respect, freedom, and peace. Stay tuned. More powerful life stories like this are coming soon. Because sometimes, walking away isn't the end, it's the beginning.